This is just to make sure that this is not the presidential debate. We didn't expect so many people, but that's good. So welcome to our 27th annual Henry George Lecture here at the University of Scranton. Jordan Petzas, the chair of the Department of Economics and Finance. The University of Scranton is proud to welcome Dr. Edward Glaeser as our honored guest tonight. Dr. Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glynn Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, and we're excited to have him speak tonight. Before we begin this evening's lecture, I would like to acknowledge the Robert Zuckerberg Foundation for their continuous generous financial support. Without this event would not be possible. Also, I would like to recognize members of the Department of Economics and Finance, Mrs. Janice Mekadon, our Economics and Finance Administrative Assistant, as well as our ODE chapter, whose commitment continues to ensure a successful Henry George event. Thank you all for your hard work. Lastly, I would like to thank each of you here tonight for attending. It's because of you and your continuous support year after year that we're able to bring such distinguished speakers to every year. As you know, several of our past Henry George speakers have received the Nobel Prize in Economics after they have delivered an annual Henry George Lecture here at the University of Scranton. And we hope this tradition will continue with you tonight, Dr. Glaeser. I would now like to invite my colleague, Dr. Susan Trastler, who will formally introduce our speaker this evening. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Dr. Petzas. I'm sure all of you are aware why we're here tonight, to listen to one of the country's top economists speak about the economics of cities. And I must congratulate you all on your choice of how to spend this evening. I mean, after all, you could have decided to spend the evening watching the final presidential debate. Or those of you with a passion for American cities could have chosen to see tonight's epic battles between San Francisco and St. Louis, if you happen to be on the National League end of things, or maybe Chicago taking on Detroit on Monday Night Football. But instead, we're here. We're here to listen to someone whose passion for cities and their role in the way they affect our lives is so readily apparent, whether you speak with him, read his work, or, as you're going to find out tonight, listen to him speak. I have a feeling that this devotion to the study of cities must have had some root in his youth, because I believe that you were born and spent your school years in Manhattan. That's a city. Professor Ed Glaeser was born in New York and earned his bachelor's degree in economics from Princeton University. In 1992, he earned his Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago. So if my math is correct, for the past 20 years, he has served on the faculty of Harvard University, where he is the Fred and Eleanor Glynn Professor of Economics. He is the director of both the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. Both of these organizations are part of the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. In those 20 years, if you look at his CV, you'll discover that he's published well over 100 articles in major journals, authored and or edited 10 books, and served on the editorial boards of numerous prestigious journals. His work on the study of cities focuses on a key theme, that proximity to one another matters, that when we understand the spatial agglomeration in cities, we can understand so much more of human activity. And with a nod to Henry George and his work, I would suggest that Dr. Glaeser's work helps us look particularly at issues of inequality, at inequality between nations, but particularly inequality within nations, inequality in housing, inequality in access to opportunities, and even inequality in our levels of happiness. His most recent book is entitled Triumph of the City: How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. This book draws together many of his ideas, and it's in an eminently readable format, and I recommend it to you all. After all, let's think about it. A book with chapters whose titles are things like, what do they make in Bangladesh? I'm sorry, in Bangalore. Is there anything greener than blacktop? What's so great about skyscrapers? And my personal favorite, is London a luxury resort? Someone with that perspective must have some interesting things about urban economics to share with us tonight. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Ed Glaeser.
Thank you very much, and thank you really all of you for being here tonight. I am well aware how precious your time is and how tempting the other joys of this evening might be, so I will try to make it worth your while. I'm deeply honored to be here. I think the University of Scranton is a very special place, and I think Scranton is a very special place, and I think very much the mission of this school is not just about educating you, but it is also about rebuilding this community. For in fact, one of the things that universities and colleges can do, have done, is to enable cities, occasionally beset by difficult economic headwinds, to find a new path forward. Indeed, it was the line of the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who also was a professor at Harvard in an earlier life, that the best way to build a world-class city was to found 2 world-class universities and wait 50 years. Apparently, this is Scranton's strategy for rebirth. I also am delighted to be here to honor Henry George, who was a remarkable person in his day. On one level, a figure that's sort of forgotten as one of the great heroes of the 19th century, but also a guy who combined a passion for equality, for social justice, with hard-headed thinking, particularly focused on land markets, right? And he had a clever way of combining a sort of thought about a more efficient tax system with a system that would be fairer for all. So I'm delighted to be here and to honor the memory of Mr. Kelly, who helped make this possible. Now, I want to start, let's see if this technology works here. I want to start with a vision, with a portrait of America. And I call this a portrait to make it very clear from the start that I have absolutely no aesthetic sense whatsoever. What you're looking at here is the 3,000-odd counties in the United States. They had been split into tenths. Each one of those dots represents a group of approximately 300 counties. And I've organized them, I've sorted them on the basis of density levels. For indeed, at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. The bottom line shows the relationship between density and income. As you can see, the line slopes upward almost at an ever-increasing slope. And the top tenth of America's counties, the densest tenth of America's counties, have incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. Extraordinary difference, and that's something that is seen almost everywhere that we look for it. The 3 largest metropolitan areas in this country, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, produce 18%, almost a fifth of America's GDP, while including only 13% of America's population. And if America's overall productivity levels rose to those seen in New York City, in the New York metropolitan area, our national GDP would go up by 43%. Now, if you look at the top line, what you're seeing is something that may be more surprising, which is the relationship between population growth and initial population density. So those places that were denser as of the year 2000 saw significantly faster population growth between 2000 and 2010 until you get to the very top tenth. So while America, at the start of the 19th century, left our dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces of the great rich American hinterland, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. And I'm sure that many of you, as you think about your futures, instead of thinking about finding a fortune on the frontier, logging or something like that in the American hinterland, have your eyes turned towards Wall Street, or towards Boston, or towards Washington, D.C., or towards one of the cities that are indeed powering the American economy. Now, this is the relationship between per capita GDP and metropolitan area density. Again, a very strong relationship. Now, one of the things as we think about our world is that we've just been, as Americans, through an amazing housing market tsunami. And this is one way of looking at that tsunami. Along the x-axis, what you're seeing here is the price change between the years 2001 and 2006. Along the y-axis is the price change between 2006 and 2011. It is normal for housing prices to give back some of what they've gained. On average, over the past 30-odd years, every dollar that an area's prices go up over a 5-year period, they give back 35 cents of that dollar over the next 5 years. That's the typical statistical relationship. It's mean reversion of housing prices. And when someone tries to sell you a house, telling you, boy, let me tell you, this area never goes down. Just look at the past 5 years. It's been doing great. That's when you should start worrying. Those areas that have been doing well are exactly the areas that will give back on average. But over the past 10 years, the degree of mean reversion has been truly astounding. This is not 32 cents on the dollar. This is 95 cents on the dollar. Almost everything that happened to housing markets between 2001 and 2006 was completely reversed, leaving, of course, the American economy in shambles as it went. Now, we don't exactly know what caused this boom. We do know that apparently irrational exuberance doesn't like cold winters very much, because the boom was disproportionately hitting the warmer parts of this country. And that's what you see here, is price growth between 2001 and 2006 and January temperature across metropolitan areas. And as you can see, the price growth was far higher in those areas that were warm than those places that are cold. One hypothesis, one guess, is that buyers in places like Las Vegas and Phoenix saw that America was moving towards warmer areas and interpreted that as meaning that housing prices need to go up in these areas. Now, of course, the foolishness of that thought is that one of the reasons why cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix were growing is that it's easy to build there. They've got an abundance of land, they've got few rules that limit building, and as a result, you can lay down thousands and thousands of homes from here to there and back again. Now, ease of building does mean population growth, but it doesn't mean high housing prices. It means exactly the reverse. It means low housing prices, which is historically what we've had in these places, and we had even through the boom in places like Houston, which perhaps is unsurprising why, and this is 2006 to 2011, it was exactly the warmer parts of the country that gave back the most, that have had the biggest hits over the past 5 years. Now, the one thing that has stayed constant over the longer haul, this is the relationship between density and housing prices between 1996 and 2012, is that the long-run price growth has occurred far more steadily in the dense areas of this country, has occurred more steadily in the most productive metropolitan areas of this area. And within those metropolitan areas, price growth has been strongest in the areas that are close to the city center, not out on the edge, and that's what you're seeing here. The bars that are marked 1 are those that are between 0 and 2 miles of the metropolitan area core. Those ones that are furthest out are more than 5 miles. Again, proximity is valuable. Now, whatever good things are happening in terms of income or housing prices or cultural or social innovation in the great cities of America, they are nothing relative to what's happening in the developing world, where humanity is changing, and it's changing through its cities. We have recently undergone this remarkable halfway point where more than half of our species now lives in urban areas. According to the UN, the switching point was 07. And it's hard not to think that on net that's a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third. Right, an extraordinary difference in well-being associated with these areas. Gandhi famously said the growth of the nation, meaning India, lies not in its cities, but in its villages. But with all due respect, on this one, the great man was completely and utterly wrong. Because, in fact, the future of India is not happening in villages, which remain trapped in the same cycles of rural poverty that have bound the nation for millennia. The changes in India are happening in places like Bangalore, and those are 2 images of Bangalore in front of you. On your left is the Mindtree campus. Mindtree is a flat world phenomenon, a software consulting company in the heart of Bangalore that provides business services throughout the world. It's a place that is crowded with young Indian talent, and not just Indian. It's a place that is at the center of a mixture of continents and cultures where people from throughout the world come to buy and sell, invest, learn, advise. On any given day, you'll run into investors from Singapore and software experts from Silicon Valley, and even the occasional socially awkward Harvard professor. Now, on a given day, there also are, on the rooftop, scores of young Indian software engineers, all of whom are crowded next to each other, learning from one another on the rooftop. It's a place where young Indians are going to get smart by being around other smart people. And that's what cities do. That is the most important thing that cities manage to do. The image on the other side of the picture is Bangalore outside of Mindtree. It's a messier world, a world that isn't entirely paved, a world where water isn't always good to drink, a world in which animals occasionally clog up city streets, a world that has not yet paid the price to make the cities places of pleasure as well as productivity. And the challenges of making the developing world's megacities livable are in some sense the challenges of the 21st century, because there is no future that involves prosperity in India and China and sub-Saharan Africa that does not involve cities. But there is no future that is not livable that does not have those cities being far better managed than they are today. And that is indeed the challenge ahead of us. Now, what you're looking at here is the relationship between population density in the US, India, and China. I showed you the US numbers, they're impressive. In India and China, the relationship is far stronger. Cities are really the only way, and those are the two top lines for the India and China numbers. Cities are really the answer in terms of economic productivity in these areas. Now, lest you think that it's all well and good that India is becoming richer because of urbanization, and China too, but we're losing the glories of rural life in India. We're losing the bucolic pastoral life of living in an Indian farm. I doubt you've been to an Indian farm anytime recently, or at least not a typical one, because those lives aren't bucolic or particularly beautiful at all. Those lives are filled with disease and suffering, and the same degree of hardship that has marked rural life for most of our species for thousands and thousands of years. In the US, there is no reported relationship between happiness and living in a city. After all, what self-respecting New Yorker is going to tell some interviewer how happy he is with his life, right? But if you go to the developing world, there is. Indeed, what you're looking at here is the relationship between self-reported life satisfaction and urbanization across all the countries in the world. This holds controlling for income as well, and it holds within countries as well, in the developing world but not in the developed world. Cities are not just places where people become more productive, but they're places where they can change their world and find a path out of poverty. Now, this rosy view of cities that I've just been giving you is awfully different from the New York City of my youth. I was born in Manhattan in 1967, and these are two iconic images from my childhood. New York had been terribly buffeted by deindustrialization, by rising crime rates, by a completely mismanaged fiscal situation in the city. And by the time the Daily News ran this headline, it seemed that not just history itself, not just Gerald Ford, but history itself was telling New York City to drop dead. That it was a dinosaur whose time had come and gone, that was no longer relevant for an America that lived in spaces built around the car, built on the edges of new Sunbelt metropolitan areas. Right? It seemed as if New York's time was done, and not just, of course, New York. Boston and Buffalo and Seattle and St. Louis and Chicago, all of them headed for the trash heap of history. The top image shows something which looks like it could have been from Planet of the Apes, perhaps. It's Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become, a once vibrant urban neighborhood, now controlled by weeds, now looking like it had no future whatsoever. And you sort of expect to walk along and find the Statue of Liberty poking through the sand as you do at the end of Planet of the Apes. President Jimmy Carter is going on his tour through this. And again, an image of cities whose time had come and gone. Things looked so dark for cities in the 1970s, in part because they seemed to have lost their historic reason for being. All of America's older, colder cities were part of a transportation problem, were part of solving that problem. If you go back to 1816, America stood on the edge of a vastly wealthy continent, a continent with tremendous coal mines, with great lakes, with cornfields, with wheat fields that could be grown, enormous wealth that was possible, and yet it was virtually inaccessible. For it cost as much to move goods 30 miles over land in 1816 as it did to ship them across the entire Atlantic Ocean. There was so much of an advantage in moving goods over water. And so we sat clinging to our Atlantic lifeline, typically in the oldest American cities where the river meets the sea. Over the course of the 19th century, we built a transportation network. First, we built the canals, like the Erie and Illinois and Michigan Canal, that made use of our natural watery connections like the Great Lakes system. And then we built railroads that supplemented them. And cities grew up on pinch points on this transportation network, like Buffalo, the western terminus of the Erie Canal, where Joseph Dart's grain elevators lifted the produce of the American hinterland out from the boats that traveled along the Great Lakes onto the boats that went onto the canals. Every one of the 20 largest American cities in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, Boston and New York, typically where the river meets the sea, to the youngest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. And cities grew up around these transportation cost advantages. They grew up around these transportation networks. Chicago, right, the linchpin of a watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans, a place that was bound to be a great city as of the 1830s, as the Illinois-Michigan Canal was being built. And then, of course, its industries grew up around it. Chicago's most famous industry was this one, the stockyards. Right? Why were stockyards in Chicago? What was this part of doing? Well, it was part of moving corn, because in fact, America, then as now, has a tremendous ability to grow corn, right? We have unbelievably rich cornfields, with or without completely misbegotten Department of Agricultural subsidies for corn. I'm terribly sorry, that was a completely unnecessary policy aside. With or without agricultural subsidies, we would still be great at growing corn. The problem is, of course, is that corn is expensive to ship. It's not a particularly high value-added product. So over the course of our 19th century history, we figured out ways to move corn across space. The earliest method of moving it, of course, was in that highly portable, highly durable, and often quite tasty product, whiskey, which could be moved from the cornfields of the Ohio River east. And then we switched from whiskey to salted pork. I don't know why, but for some reason, our species has tended to find salted pork more tasty than salted beef. But salting the product made it durable, and hence Cincinnati became America's porkopolis, the city that specialized in salting and shipping the pork over space. And then, of course, finally, when this guy, Armour, figures out refrigerated rail cars, right? So refrigerated rail cars, you can freeze the stuff, so you don't have to salt it to move it over distance. You can move from salted pork to frozen beef. And that's what Armour did, and that's what those stockyards were about. They were about taking corn-fed beef, slaughtering them, freezing them, shipping them to the markets of the East. The great Armour invention was you put the ice blocks on top of the beef instead of below them, so the cold water drips down, keeping the beef cold during the train trip east. A similar process made Buenos Aires at the same time period. It was the frigorificos, the frozen ships that moved the Argentine beef across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, everything that I've just said about cities makes them sound like they're trying to solve an operations research problem. You know, where do you put the city to minimize the transportation costs and reap advantages of the scale economies of having a big stockyard? And that's part of why cities existed, right? I mean, Scranton is unthinkable without anthracite coal, right? I mean, it's part of having a city that's close to the coal mines. It's part of why the city existed. But even when cities exist for utterly mundane reasons, for proximity to the wheat fields and the corn fields of Iowa, magical things happen when smart people connect with one another. It has always been thus. Right? It was that way 2,500 years ago when Plato and Socrates bickered on an Athenian street corner. It was that way in 15th century Florence. Right? A city built on wool and banking, not a city built for art's sake, but still a chain of genius that starts with Brunelleschi's ability to understand linear perspective, painting in 3 dimensions, passes it along to Donatello, who puts it in low-relief sculpture on the wall of Orson Michele, passes it along to Masaccio, who puts it in the wall of the Brancacci Chapel, that marvelous picture of St. Peter finding a silver coin in the belly of a fish, passes it along to Fra Filippo Lippi, that, as I'm sorry to say here at a Jesuit school, that less than saintly monk, Fra Filippo Lippi, and passes it along to Botticelli and so forth, a chain of genius, each person building on each other's idea, collaboratively creating something magical. And so it was in Chicago in the 1880s as well. This building, the one on your left, is often called the world's first skyscraper. A skyscraper being a relatively tall building with a load-bearing steel or cast iron skeleton. This building, the Home Insurance Building, was not that tall for its time. There were taller buildings like St. Pancras Station in London. You can visit St. Pancras today. It's had a wonderful restoration. And if you look at St. Pancras, you see the problem of the old style of building. It has walls like a medieval fortress. I mean, they're like 10 feet thick. Incredibly expensive to build this way. That's a traditional load-bearing wall. Home insurance, graceful, tall, goes to the sky. The load is being borne by a cast iron-sized steel skeleton, just as the balloon frame houses that populated the American West were borne by a light skeleton of various boards. Now, its architect, William LeBaron Jenney, is often called the father of the skyscraper. But, of course, there's a lively architectural history debate about whether Jenny deserves this credit or whether or not home insurance is actually the first skyscraper. Because, in fact, home insurance is not a proper skyscraper. Only the front two walls have a load-bearing steel skeleton. The back two walls are thick. They're traditional masonry-bearing walls. And indeed, the critics have carped upon Jenny's claim, claiming that, of course, there were lots of industrial buildings that were tall with cast-iron skeletons that predated home insurance, and there were plenty of architects who had similar ideas at the same time. So why isn't Louis Sullivan? Why isn't Daniel Burnham? Why isn't Adler? Why isn't Root? Why are one of these many Chicago architects given the credit of being the father of the skyscraper? I would submit to you that any attempt to find the father of the skyscraper is a fool's errand, because the skyscraper, like almost everything else our species has ever done, is not a solo invention. It's something that was invented collaboratively. All of these characters knew each other. Sullivan and Burnham, two giants of 19th and early 20th century architecture, were both apprentices in Jenny's office. They all knew each other. They all stole each other's ideas. They all borrowed thoughts from each other. They were connected by the city of Chicago, which brought together architectural genius in large quantities after the Great Chicago Fire. Collaboratively, they learned from each other. Collaboratively, they made this invention work. It's not that Jenny was some giant watershed. Before him, there was nothing. After him, there was a skyscraper. He was a part of a chain of genius, just like Athenian philosophy or Renaissance art. And just like automobiles in Detroit, a similar cluster of genius that occurred 10 years later. Now, Detroit is, of course, a classic inland port, Detroit, the Straits. And what could be more natural for an inland port to have than industries like Detroit Waterworks, right? Over there, Detroit. This cutting-edge shipping company that built engines and boats that plied the Great Lakes. This company then employed talented people like the young Henry Ford, who came to Detroit and taught Ford about engines. Then as now, one of the things that cities do is they're forges of human capital. They're places that we get smart by trying new experiences. When we look at wage data, we see that people who come to cities don't earn big wage gains overnight. What they experience is year by year, month by month, they have faster wage growth. They become more productive by being exposed to new ideas. And that as you consider your first jobs, remember you're not just getting a job that pays you more then. You want to be thinking about what that job is going to give you 20 years from now. What are the skills that it's going to give you that's going to make you more productive over the course of your lifetime? Now, it turns out Henry Ford got plenty out of the skills he got at Detroit Dry Dock, which is this company. And indeed, he went on to work for Thomas Alva Edison. And then he joined the great American chase to build a mass-produced automobile. Germans, of course, invented the car by its normal definition with the internal combustion engine. But it's Americans that made it cheap. And Ford, of course, does deserve pride of place, but he was hardly alone. The first person in Detroit to build a car was a guy called Charles Kirby. And according to legend, Ford followed Kirby as Kirby drove his car down the street, pedaling furiously on his bicycle, because he was so eager to figure out how Kirby's car worked. Right? I don't know if this is true, but I love it, because it illustrates the urban ability to move ideas, to shed knowledge. Ford was trying to learn from Kirby's car, and it's the ability of cities to enable us to learn from other things that continues to make cities so vital today. And of course, it's not just about Ford, it's not just about Kirby, it's about the Dodge brothers, the Fisher brothers, David Dunbar Buick, Ransom Olds, Billy Durant, and nearby Flint, a cluster of genius, a whole group of entrepreneurs, just like Silicon Valley in the 1960s, smart people, all of whom were competing with each other, supplying each other with financing, and of course, stealing each other's ideas, right? If you think there's anything unusual about the Facebook effect and about the Facebook story, I submit to you that all entrepreneurship is like this, that ideas are borrowed from one another, and the Facebook story of idea exchange in Cambridge in the last decade is absolutely the norm for production of new ideas, and it reminds us that new technologies have not made the importance of face-to-face contact in any sense obsolete. Now, the great tragedy for Detroit is this was Ford's big idea. The River Rouge, a vast vertically integrated plant walled off from the outside world. On one level, this was an absolute triumph for American industry. It made Detroit perhaps the most productive place on the planet by 1950, a place that gave spectacular wages, $5 days, to ordinary Americans who couldn't possibly have earned anything like this doing anything else. It provided cheap cars for ordinary Americans, unbelievably great things for lots of Americans who gained mobility as a result of this. But while this was a great thing for short-run productivity, It was a terrible thing for urban reinvention, urban regeneration. Smart, successful cities at the start of the 19th century, in the age of Alexander Hamilton's New York or Matthew Boulton's Birmingham, were distinguished by three characteristics: small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. The same three attributes lead to urban regeneration today: small firms, smart people, and connections to the outside world. How far from that is the Rouge, right? A vast firm. Workers had no need for a college degree even, let alone perhaps even not even a high school degree. And of course, those workers live in a self-enclosed universe. It's not that this is bad, but it doesn't need the city and it doesn't give to the city. It is an entity unto itself. And when conditions change, and they always change, you just move that factory to another place. The big fact over the 20th century in manufacturing is the decline in the cost of moving goods. So at the start of the 20th century, it was really important to have your factories near the Great Lakes, so you could bring in the inputs that you needed to make cars, so you could ship the cars when they finally got produced on the great rail network. By the end of the 20th century, these were irrelevant. This is the cost of moving a ton a mile by rail over the 20th century in the United States. There's been roughly a 90% decline in how expensive it is to move goods by rail over the past 100 years. So whereas this proximity, this closeness to the waterways, to the rail networks, were critical 100 years ago, they were irrelevant by 1960. And as transportation costs declined, you could move factories. You could move them to suburbs first, like Ford did in moving it to the River Rouge. You could move it to lower cost locations, like the right-to-work states in the American South. The work of Tom Holmes at the University of Minnesota compares counties on opposite sides of right-to-work lines. And he finds that those counties that are in pro-business areas had substantially more, vastly more industrial growth after 1947 than those counties that were in the pro-union side of those states. And of course, you could move those industrial jobs outside the US altogether. Now, one way of seeing this is what happened over the course of the 20th century is we moved from having cities that were defined by producer advantages, defined by proximity to, I don't know, a coal mine, or to the Great Lakes, or some other thing that led to a natural production advantage for the firm, to cities that are consumer cities, that are located in places where people want to live, rather than in places where you have access to the Great Lakes. Now, apparently, if this is your interpretation of history, apparently the thing Americans really wanted above all was warmer winters. Because, in fact, there's no variable that better predicts metropolitan area growth over the course of the 20th century than January temperature. Now, there are a lot of things rolled into that. There's also the relatively pro-business policies of the old Confederacy. There's also the enormously pro-housing policies of many of our Sunbelt cities. All of these things go together, and it couldn't have happened without technological innovations like the air conditioner that made living in hot areas more possible, and even more so, having factories in hot areas. But there's no getting around the fact that for all of us who live in colder climates, this has been a tremendous burden in terms of population decline. Along with the move to sun was the move to sprawl. We have always built our living spaces, our urban spaces, around the transportation technology that was dominant in the era in which they were produced. Go to the center of an old European city, not Paris, of course, which was rebuilt during a later era, but Rome, for example, or Florence, or even the downtown areas of New York, or the oldest parts of Boston. You see pedestrian cities, cities that are built around walking, narrow streets. The streets wind. The sidewalks are there, but they're narrow and they're clustered. Right? These are cities that are built on an eminently human scale. And then you see cities that are built around wheeled carts, around horse-drawn omnibuses, and they have grids. And the blocks are a little bit longer, and they're straighter because it's hard to turn those vehicles on a dime the way that you would if you were walking around Beacon Hill. And then you go to places like Brookline, the Philadelphia Main Line, streetcar suburbs, or suburbs built around the early rail cars. That's also true of Upper Manhattan, an area that's built around the elevated line that would have taken my great-grandfather down to work 100 years ago. And then, of course, we'd go to the areas built around the car. Now, it's not surprising that Americans chose to rebuild their space around the car. The average commute by car in this country is 24 minutes. The average commute by public transportation is 48 minutes. There is something like a 15 to 20-minute time fixed cost any time you engage in public transportation. Walking to the stop, waiting for the thing to pick you up, and going from where it drops you off to the final destination. This is the nature of public transportation.
So it's not surprising that this was appealing. Of course, it was a huge shock to our urban spaces, and it involved an entire rethinking about how human beings exist. Because whereas all of these older transportation technologies were fundamentally hub and spoke, you still had to walk from the subway stop to your final destination. Cars are point to point. They both require vast amounts of space and enable you to consume lots and lots of space. And all of this came out of the cars. Now, I'm an economist. I believe in choice. I think it's a great thing that Americans have lots of different places that they can potentially live. I myself commute by car to work. But we do have to ask ourselves about subsidization of certain types of transit. We do have to ask ourselves about the vast amount of federal spending that went on highways. Each new highway that cut into a metropolitan area core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18% relative to the metropolitan area as a whole, right? And while historically the Highway Trust Fund was paid for out of gas taxes, where drivers at least are paying for the cost of their cars, starting with the stimulus package, then more recently in the last June's highway bill, we've been using general tax revenues to pay for cars rather than user fees. There's a principle that economists have adhered to over the past 230 years, that the good infrastructure is paid for best when users pay for it. And that a bridge makes sense if the people who take the bridge are willing to pay enough to sustain the cost of building that bridge. The same principle goes for highways. It's not that I've got any problem with highways whatsoever, but the basic principle should not be that ordinary taxpayers are funding people to drive, are essentially bribing people to drive longer distances. And that's at least how I would think about the issues with federal transit policy. Now, it's not that having some federal spending on subways makes up for it, because in fact, spending on highways is transformative to areas that otherwise have little transportation access. Spending on monorails or on subway systems is not transformative to cities that are already well connected. After all, these cities already had ways to getting around. And yet, after the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1973, this is exactly what the federal government was there to do. It was there to subsidize building urban transit systems. Now, this follows in a long line of the federal government actually following something of a Potemkin village strategy approach to cities. Potemkin village meaning a strategy that emphasized how it looked, the physical side of things, rather than investing in the things that cities really need. Cities may look like buildings. Cities may look like transportation infrastructure. But at their heart, cities are people. That's what cities are. Cities are human capital, connected by infrastructure. And indeed, cities need infrastructure to thrive. But not every city needs infrastructure. And the hallmark of declining cities is that they have an abundance of structures and infrastructure relative to the level of demand, relative to the number of people. Detroit was a city built for 1.85 million people. It now has less than half of it. It's easy to get around the city. You don't need a monorail that glides over essentially empty streets. And yet that's exactly like an old Simpsons episode. That's exactly what the Federal Highway Aid Act did, is it built a monorail to glide over essentially empty streets. Just like earlier, we had urban renewal policy programs that put down new housing units in cities where housing was cheap and abundant. Indeed, more than 90% of the homes in central city Detroit are valued at significantly below construction costs. How can it possibly make sense to subsidize new construction in such places? And yet, that is still what policies like the low-income housing tax credit do in these areas. Hit by the move to sun and sprawl, almost all of America's older, colder cities lost massive amounts of their population. This may look like an oddball list of cities to you, but this was the 10 largest cities in the U.S. as of 1950. Right? Out of these, 8 out of these 10 lost 23% or more of their population, I think. And 3 of them lost more than 50% of their population. Cleveland, St. Louis, Detroit are but a shadow of their former self, hit by the move to sun and sprawl and the deindustrialization. 2 cities are larger. One, New York, which has slightly stayed ahead, and LA, of course, which is a completely different model of urban area, one built around the car, one built around the sun. Now, if I were to stop with a story of Detroit, right, and you can still go to Detroit Dry Dock, to that old cutting-edge company, and it's an empty hull of a once beautiful industrial building. If I were to stop with that story, then this would be a very sad lecture. But of course, that's not where the story ends. Because while some cities like Detroit and Cleveland and St. Louis have yet to find their footing, other cities like San Francisco and Seattle and New York have. It's easy to forget, as we think about glorious Seattle today, capital of the information age, that in 1971, 2 real estate jokers put up a sign on the way out of town asking the last person to leave to please turn off the lights. Because Seattle's major employer, the General Motors of Washington State, Boeing, had been cutting back on its jobs. And just as no one could imagine Detroit with less employment in General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. This is before Microsoft, before Costco, before Amazon, and Starbucks is at best the faint whiff of an aroma in a coffee roaster's nostrils. Boston, too, a city that reinvented itself. These are two of the people who remade Boston. The person that you're looking at, they're both actually supposed to be people, but I actually couldn't get a non-copyrighted version of a picture of the other guy, who I'll come to in a second. The picture of the person on your left is Vannevar Bush, a great statesman of science, the founder of Raytheon, as well as an MIT professor, someone who helped create the technological community in Boston that has later come to completely encompass MIT, the heart of the new economy in Boston. The work of Enrico Moretti finds, echoing that Moynihan quotation with which I began the lecture, that indeed having a land-grant college funded by the federal government, reminding us that the federal government has done great things as well as not so wise things, but the land-grant college system had a huge impact on cities subsequent to 1980. Those cities that were lucky enough to have a land-grant did phenomenally better than those cities that didn't. And that's true in population growth and in incomes. Boston's land-grant college, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, right, an extraordinary anchor for our local economy. And Vannevar Bush is one of the many reasons why. Bush was also the mentor of a guy called Fred Terman, who would later go back to Stanford and found something called the Stanford Industrial Park, which was the home of Silicon Valley. He was very much borrowing the model that his mentor, Vannevar Bush, had given him. The other picture of the building is the Arthur D. Little building in Cambridge at MIT. Arthur D. Little was the start of the Boston management consulting industry. He was a chemist from MIT. He set up, for example, General Motors' first R&D lab, and was another bridge from academia to commerce. Now, this helps us understand, is a picture that helps us think through why education and why skills are so important to urban regeneration. The picture you're looking at here shows the relationship between the share of the population with a college degree as of the years 1970 and population growth between 1970 and 2000, just in the Northeast and the Midwest. Now, this relationship also holds in the South and the West, but much more weakly. For indeed, these areas that have the short-run trends of history on their side, Las Vegas doesn't need skill. It burbles along with warm weather and gambling, and it just charges forward in easy housing construction. Skills are most necessary when you're hit by hardship, when you need to reinvent yourself, when you need to have entrepreneurs who figure out something new for the city to be done, and that's exactly what the data shows us. This is an old hypothesis in economics associated with T.W. Schultz and Linus Welch. As you can see, the most skilled metropolitan areas, 53% growth. The least skilled metropolitan areas, less than 10% growth. This graph, which I didn't have when I was writing my book because it involves data from the 2010 census, shows the relationship across all the counties in the United States between share of the population with a college degree. I've just sorted those counties into fifths, and population growth. Enormously tight connection between skills and success, which is why places like the University of Scranton are so important for the success of the Scranton metropolitan area. This is the relationship between per capita GDP across cities and the share of adults with a college degree. As the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up on average by 10%, your wages go up on average by 8%, holding your years of schooling constant. Having skilled neighbors is really crucial. And as you look for jobs in your own life, make sure you have smart people around you so you'll learn from them. Because this is how we get smart in life, by being around other smart people. Now that is ultimately the explanation for the great paradox that lies at the heart of this talk. We live in an age in which distance is dead, in which we can effortlessly telecommute to whatever woodsy spot appeals to our love of nature. We can all just dial it in. And yet in so many places, in so many ways, we choose the inconveniences of city life. Why? Why weren't the cyberseers and technoprophets who predicted that cities would become obsolete 20 years ago, who predicted that email and the internet and fax machines for that matter, or even the telephone, as the prophets of 120 years ago, why is it that they didn't make cities and the face-to-face contact that happens in cities obsolete? I think the reason for that is what globalization and new technologies have done is they've increased the returns to being smart. They've increased the returns to innovation. And our greatest talent as a species is our ability to learn from the people around us. We come out of the womb with this remarkable ability to pick up knowledge from our parents, from our peers, from our siblings, even occasionally from our teachers. Cities help that process to happen. Cities help us to get smart by being around other smart people, particularly in skilled cities. Anyone who has ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your script. That's easy. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. Now, we have evolved over millions of years to have these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion, and those cues are lost when we're not in the same room. Those cues are lost when we cannot breathe the same air and read each other's cues. And the more complicated the idea is, the more critical it is to be in the same room, which is why Google, of all the companies in the world, Google should be able to handle long-distance working, should be sending everyone home to dial it in on some super-fast connection. What does Google do instead of that? They build the Googleplex, so they can be right on top of each other. Indeed, there is no industry where you would expect long-distance work to be more common than Silicon Valley. And yet Silicon Valley is the most famous example of an industrial cluster in the world today. That's what's happened with the returns to knowledge. Innovations become more important. We innovate, we learn by being around other smart people. That's why finance is so heavily centered in cities. There's no industry in which having a little bit of extra knowledge is worth more, that can make you a millionaire overnight, than finance. So it's worthwhile putting up with the inconveniences of city living in order to get that knowledge. Think about trading floors. Think about the anomaly of trading floors. Here are some of the wealthiest people on the planet who in any normal industry would sit in vast offices like a university dean, surrounded by, assistants and oaken doors and large desks, right, enjoying all the perquisites of privacy that their wealth has given them access to. And yet here they are, right, in the trading floor, sweating on top of each other, getting guacamole on top of each other, being uncomfortable. Why are they there? Because knowledge is more important than space. And that's why cities came back, because knowledge is more important than space. Okay, this is the relationship between skills and earnings across metropolitan areas in India, US, and China. If anything, you notice the Indian effect is just unbelievably vast. This is the relationship between unemployment and education across metropolitan areas. If you want to understand the patterns of which metropolitan areas got badly hit by our downturn, skills also predict it. If you want to understand across countries why some places are wealthier than another, skills imply that as well. This is the relationship between PISA math scores, right, and earnings across places. So it is wonderful when I hear political leaders talk about all the things America needs, like green energy and infrastructure and education. But let me tell you something. One of these things is not like the others. That in fact, education, human capital, is the bedrock on which the economic success of this country rests. And if we expect our children and grandchildren, or heck, just you, to be wealthy 50 years from now, you will be as wealthy as your skills merit. And that will be the fundamental determinant of the long-run strength of the United States. And when we come to thinking about that strength, and this is from some work that Paul Peterson and Rick Hanishek and Ludger Grossman have done, we're doing all right. So this is the growth in math reading, and science test scores over the past 20 years. They've ranked all the countries. And from the highest growth areas, which is Latvia is doing spectacularly well. Chile, which is number 2. We're actually not part of this group. We're this one. We're the green line. We're right in the middle. So we're not doing badly with all this work from No Child Left Behind and A Nation at Risk and Race to the Top. We're actually achieving some test score gains. But we're not closing the gap with the high flyers at all. We're staying right in the middle of the pack. And this is not just because we started being more educated. We're that green dot here. In fact, there's very little relationship between starting better and having higher test score gains. Because gosh, look at Singapore. Singapore started unbelievably well, and they're still having high test score gains. On the other hand, look at Chile and Brazil. These are places that are really come from behind. Where are we? We're right in the middle. We're not doing better or worse. We're somehow or other plowing ahead in mediocrity. Now, across states in the Union, there does tend to be a strong tendency for there to be catch-up. This is student performance on the NAEP in 1992 and subsequent test score growth. Places that started with fewer skills have done better. Places that started with more skills have done worse in terms of test score gains. And it's particular places like Iowa, which was the birthplace of the high school movement in America, that have experienced the biggest relative declines. There are a couple of different places that have done really well, and they're following very different models. Notice Maryland and Massachusetts, both big gainers in terms of test scores, but they've done things by rapidly increasing the amount of spending per pupil. Whereas Florida, which as far as I can tell to a first-order approximation spends nothing on any of its students, has also done spectacularly well in terms of increasing test scores. Now, there are, and I'm just going to give you a highlight on this because education is so central. I'm going to give you 3 types of findings on this that have come out in recent years, all from people who are affiliated with the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, one of which is the work on teacher quality. We've long known that some teachers appear to have outsized effects on test scores. The work of Raj Chetty and John Friedman and Jonah Rockoff adds to this by looking at what happens when high-quality teachers move into classes mid-year. So there's no way that people were gaming this system. The teachers just showed up in mid-year. This is what happens to test scores after you throw in a high value-added teacher, right? Incredible effects. And I think every one of you have had the experience of having a special teacher in your life, so you can understand what a difference this means. But here's the second thing, the more remarkable thing. Teacher effects on test scores fade out over time, but teacher effects on earnings don't. And here they're able to use IRS records on earnings to look at the impact of different teachers that you've been exposed to on how much you earn at age 28. This is the relationship between teacher value added on test scores and teacher value added on earnings. Incredibly positive effect. Hard to imagine anything more critical for the quality of America's schools than getting higher quality people, whatever that means, into schools. Next fact, we have a whole series of work now on charter schools. And the beauty of charter schools from a research design perspective is they use lotteries when they're successful. So you've got randomization, you've got treatment and control, you're able to compare the people who win with the people who lose. And all the nonsense that you hear by the enemies of charter schools about how this is all faked in some way is nothing but nonsense, right? This is actually real hard science. Now, the one thing that you do want to be clear about, and this graph makes this clear, is that the charter schools that actually have lotteries are the good ones, because in fact people don't try to go to schools that are actually significantly underperformers. And indeed, even this shows, these are the lottery effects for New York City schools, not all of these are positive. There are a bunch of New York City charters that are underperforming. Right? The ideal is that these schools will actually go out of business over time, just as not every good new restaurant is a winner, not every great new charter school is a winner. Hopefully the successful ones will win, and I think it's perfectly right to have government regulatory policies that make sure we prod the low-performing ones to either do better or go out of business. But this shows the difference. It shows that, in fact, it's not a terrible correlation between just the raw test scores and these lottery-adjusted ones. But what actually explains which scores do better? This is the strongest correlation one. It's just instructional time. In fact, these charter schools just have much longer days than the equivalent public schools. It's that simple. And none of these other things make much of a difference. Per pupil expenditure, irrelevant. Class size, irrelevant. These with master's degrees, irrelevant. Last thing I want to show you, Josh Goodman. In the 1980s, something that is long before most of your time, there was a whole big furor about the nation at risk and about how we weren't educating our children. As a result, many states enacted much stronger minimum math and science requirements. This meant that particularly disadvantaged youths just got a lot more math and science, even if they had the same number of years of schooling. This enables you to estimate, by comparing the students who were treated with these big changes in years and comparing them with people who lived in states that weren't changed, what the impact of a year of math and science is on earnings. The work of my colleague Josh Goodman finds in minority youth, it's worth about an 8% increase in earnings, an extra year of math or science. Huge impacts of math or science education on long-run outcomes, which, of course, for all of those who like teaching math, plays to all of our worst biases. Okay, but when we think about cities, surely the most important skills that are in cities are not those skills that are taught in the classroom. They're the skills that are learned afterwards on the city streets. You know, 50 years ago, and surely the most important of those skills are the talents and inclination to be an entrepreneur. Because ultimately, it's those entrepreneurs, it's those new businesses, the people like Jeff Bezos, right? The people like Bill Gates, who are actually in the business of actually transforming urban economies. Those skills and talents to be an entrepreneur are things that are not constant across areas. And 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz pointed at New York and Pittsburgh and noted that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh even then. He argued that this difference reflected a culture of entrepreneurship in New York that had been inculcated by New York's traditional industry, the garment trade, the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s, larger than automobile production in Detroit. And like automobile production, in fact, even to a larger degree, it was hammered by globalization. Right? Hundreds of thousands of garment jobs lost in a short period of time in New York. But the difference between the garment trade and General Motors is that the garment trade was filled with small, nimble firms because it was an industry that anyone with a good idea and a couple of sewing machines could get started in. And those entrepreneurs, when the situation changed, were nimble enough to look for new opportunity. They could start an electronic greeting card company. They could do something totally apart because they were entrepreneurs and their kids were entrepreneurs. On the other hand, the middle managers at U.S. Steel, right, these guys wouldn't know a new opportunity if it hit them on the head. They were tremendously productive in the short run, great parts of a corporate machine, but no good at reinventing the city. And indeed, measures of entrepreneurship like average firm size do a remarkably good job of predicting urban regeneration. Those metropolitan areas with a few big firms have had far less successful time periods than those areas with small, nimble firms. And that's what you're seeing here. I've ranked those metropolitan areas by average firm size. Other measures like the share of employment in startups do similarly well. It turns out having access to mines, and I'm bringing this up specifically for Scranton, is associated with having much larger firms, like the mines of Pittsburgh, typically because mines themselves are large enterprises and they support manufacturing enterprises that are large as well. The legacy of those mines is yet another natural resource curse, that those places that were endowed with mines in the late 19th, early 20th century have had less growth and less entrepreneurship more recently. While we all think of entrepreneurship as a great thing, what policies those imply are very, very hard. It's not as if local governments are good venture capitalists. It's not as if they can figure out what firms to possibly run. I often think the best local economic development strategy is to attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. Boston is trying to pursue a policy of creating an innovation district right now by creating a bunch of housing and space that's entrepreneurship friendly. We still don't know how it'll work. Now, the most entrepreneurship place I've ever been in my life is the Dharavi slum of Mumbai, a place that is crowded with the energy of human potential. You know, you walk into one shop and there are a couple of guys sewing brassieres and you swear you're on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1907. And then you look across the street and there are women who are sitting on the floor recycling plastics, and you hope that those syringes are going to be cleaned before they're used for something else. And then you go a little bit further down and there's a ceramics cluster, and they're making these beautiful little pots, and they're so proud of them they won't even take any money from you for giving them to them. And you go further down, there are guys who are recycling boxes, and that means chopping the boxes up, turning them inside down so no one can see the old labels. The good thing about the piled boxes is you can sleep on them too if you get a little bit tired. And that's great, but then you go outside in the streets and you see a kid defecating in the street, and you see the streets are unpaved, and you know the water is unclean. And it reminds you that as magical a place as Dharavi is, it's also a place that shows the tremendous challenges facing our cities. Dharavi is not a problem because it has poor people. Cities should never apologize for their poverty. Cities have poor people not because cities make people poor, but because cities attract poor people with economic opportunity, with the promise of new jobs, with a better social safety net, with the ability to get around without a car for every adult. My own work on this finds that poverty rates go up near where you build new subway stops. That doesn't mean that those subway stops are impoverishing people. It means that those subway stops are attracting people who are poor. And so it is in places like Dharavi throughout the world. But it does remind us that if two people are close enough to exchange an idea face to face, they're also close enough to exchange a contagious disease. And if I'm close enough to sell you a newspaper, I'm close enough to pick your pocket. And for thousands of years, cities have been dealing with the demons of density, trying to make these highly productive, highly innovative agglomerations of talent into places that you actually also want to live in. And indeed, when we think about the problems of New York of the 1970s, it was also that the city had become unlivable, unheavenly in Ed Banfield's memorable phrase. Now, this is an old problem, particularly disease is an old problem. A boy born in New York City could expect to live 7 years less than the national average in 1900. By today, life expectancies in New York are 3 years more than the national average. No one exactly understands why death rates are lower in New York. Some people credit social connection or walking among the elderly. Among the young, it's quite easy to see why death rates are lower in New York. Two major factors: lower levels of motor vehicle accidents. It's just a lot safer to take the subway after having a few drinks than to get behind the wheel of a car. And lower levels of suicide rates. In fact, massively lower levels of suicide rates in dense cities. Some people have claimed that this has something to do with gun culture, for indeed there is a strong correlation between hunting licenses per capita and teen suicide rates across America's counties. But this didn't happen by accident. New York did not become healthy without cities and towns spending an enormous amount on clean water. And indeed, at the start of the 20th century, America's cities and towns were spending as much on water as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Now, to get there required a few false steps. So in the 1790s, when the water problem was first being faced, there was a yellow fever epidemic that went across America's cities, leading cities to think that they needed clean water, although yellow fever is, of course, a mosquito-borne epidemic. Philadelphia went the public route. This is with Latrobe. Built the Philadelphia Water Works, by and large, a relatively successful enterprise. New York went a different route. And this route was the brainchild of two of America's founding fathers. These are, of course, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. And later, after this episode with water, Burr would, of course, shoot Hamilton on the shores of the Hudson. But before Burr shot Hamilton, he hired him to be his lawyer. And Burr's scheme was that he wanted a bank. He wanted a bank that could compete with Hamilton's own Bank of New York, for that matter. But he wasn't going to get a bank easily because, in fact, licenses to run a bank, charters to run a bank, were just given out. His idea was to have a bank attached to a water company. So he hired Hamilton, who then convinced his Federalist buddies on New York City Council that New York shouldn't possibly pay for the burthensome taxes, and that's a direct quote, of having public waterworks. Instead, they should have an early version of a public-private partnership, a company that was a great public asset of providing clean water that would be subsidized by being able to run a bank. Now, any of you who have studied economics know that this is an absolutely idiotic idea. You don't subsidize a very socially valuable but not very lucrative activity by giving the entity the ability to do some alternatively totally different activity that happens to pay incredibly well. Right? What would you think about providing an entity with the ability to be an investment bank or a bank and also to provide clean water? What do you expect this entity would do? Would it provide a lot of clean water or would it do a lot of banking? Well, of course, it would do a lot of banking. And of course, this is the entity today. Right? It is J.P. Morgan Chase that was the Chase Manhattan Bank that was the bank of the Manhattan Water Company. And the story that you hear on Wikipedia that this octagon is the cross-section of a water pipe is in fact an urban myth. It is false. But if it helps you remember the story and the fact that it's a warning about trying to solve problems on the cheap, which actually require massive amounts of infrastructure investment, that's a good warning for you to keep around. Now, not every urban problem can be solved with large-scale engineering investment. We can't just build our way out of traffic congestion. There's something called the fundamental law of highway congestion, which is that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive, okay? We can't continue running a Soviet-style transit policy in this country. And by this I mean that in the old Soviet Union, they used to have grocery stores that would give out eggs, butter, fish, what have you, for pennies on the dollar, for far less than the market price. What happens when you give away goods for far less than the market price? There are long lines. There are stockouts. You can't get the goods. Well, that's what we do with our city streets. We give a valuable asset away, access to drive on city streets. We give it away for free, right? We do this for the highways as well. We give it away for free. What do we get? The equivalent of long lines and stockouts. They're called traffic jams. You don't actually get a sane transit policy unless you charge people for the social cost of their action. You charge them for the congestion. You charge them for the pollution. You charge them for the potential deaths on vehicles. Singapore is the second densest country in the world, a place you think would be impossible to get around. And yet, the roads move effortlessly. Why? They have these electronic road pricing mechanisms that charge you on a real-time basis for driving around downtown Singapore. Every car is a transponder. You don't have to slow down. You move effortlessly all the time. It may be expensive, but you know, if you can't afford it, you don't drive. You take public transportation or some other way of doing this, which of course means that you do need a viable public transportation system, almost assuredly one that's bus-dominated, because buses are a highly flexible, far more affordable means of doing public transit than trains, but you need public transit not the less. But if you do these things, if you have a city that handles the contagious disease, the crime, the congestion problems, it can be a place of remarkable pleasure as well as productivity. And we know this, all of you who have seen the rebirth of Philadelphia or New York or Boston, that the same urban competition that can make cities productive can make them fun, that the innovation in restaurants can make cities a joy, that the constant flow of new products, of new clubs, of new ideas, and just the sheer crush of humanity can make cities an absolute pleasure to be in. Now, one of the downsides, I have 2 points I have to get through, and then I'll be done. One of the downsides, though, of success is if an area becomes increasingly successful, more pleasurable, more productive, but doesn't build more housing, it risks becoming a boutique town affordable only to the wealthy. What you're looking at here is the decline in the amount of permitting. That's the line that falls down in New York. The rise is the rise of prices. Just as New York became more attractive to live in, it made it more difficult to build in. This is through height limitations, historic preservation districts, and this is what Jane Jacobs, who was in so many ways a peerless observer of cities, got wrong. She looked at old housing and new housing, noted that old housing was cheap and new housing was expensive, which led her to conclude that the way to make sure that Manhattan stayed affordable was to make sure that no one built any new housing on top of old housing. Now, anyone who's even had Economics 101 notes immediately the tremendous fallacy of that argument, right? If you have a commodity, urban space that's in scarce demand, and you restrict the supply of it, you know, high demand colliding into fixed supply means high prices. And you don't have to look any further than her own home area of Greenwich Village, which was affordable to ordinary Americans like herself and her husband in the 1950s, which is now a place where townhouses start at $5 million and hedge fund managers only need apply to see the impact of the preservation district that she herself had put in. Now, one of the reasons why cities need to get their act together, particularly in the developing world, and Mumbai, this is a picture of Mumbai, has some of the most draconian land use limitations anywhere, is that cities actually also have something to give to the environment. And I want to illustrate this point with a story of a young Harvard College graduate who, on a beautiful spring day in 1844, went for a walk in the woods outside of Concord. And he did a little fishing, and the fishing was good because there hadn't been much rain lately. But when he came to cook the fish into a chowder, the winds fanned the flames into the nearby dry grass, and a fire started and it spread, and by the time it was done, the fire was a raging inferno that had burned down more than 300 acres of prime woodlands, a whole ecosystem wiped out by the carelessness of this young man. In his own day, he was castigated as an enemy of the environment. The Concord Freeman called him a flibberty gibbet, which I think was pretty bad for 1844. Of course, today, he is somewhat oddly venerated as the secular saint of American environmentalism. This young man, of course, was none other than Henry David Thoreau, whose book, Walden, seems to tell what a great thing it is for us to live surrounded by nature. But his own life appears to preach a very different moral, because it's hard to think of any young man in 1844 living in Cambridge or New York who did as much damage to the environment as Thoreau did. His life reminds us that we are a destructive species, and if you love nature, it is often best to stay away from it. As indeed Thoreau would have done his beloved nature so much good if he had actually stayed at home in New York or Cambridge instead of going out into the middle of the woods outside of Concord lighting fires left and right. Now, it turns out that there's a statistical version of this, which is, together with environmentalist, UCLA environmental economist Matthew Kahn, I've measured carbon emissions in different parts of the country, and it's unsurprising that people who live in big cities, even controlling for income and family size, have significantly lower levels of energy use and significantly lower levels of carbon emissions than people who live out in suburban areas. And I don't care if you're worried about global warming or you're just worried about the price of gas at the pump. We all have a lot to gain to make sure that China and India build up rather than out. Because if their carbon emissions rise to the level seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by 130%. If they stop at the level seen at wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%. A huge gap. And I think the best way that we can do this is not by artificially boosting our cities, not by saying no to Americans who want to choose different areas. I mean, heck, I live in a suburb not so far away from where Thoreau burnt all those woods. And when I moved from Cambridge to that suburb, I started to do almost as much damage to the environment as Thoreau did, right? We should have choices. Freedom is a hallmark of this country, and it's a great hallmark. But we should also make sure that we have policies that don't stack the deck against our cities. That means policies that make sure that drivers pay for the roads they use. That means that we don't try to socially engineering people out of urban apartments into suburban homes by having radically pro-home ownership policies. And most of all, and most critically, we need policies that do a better job of caring for our children, for everyone's children, whether or not they live in city or suburb. And I think if I think about the single biggest barrier to urban growth, it is the fact that people leave our cities to move into schools. But I don't want to stop on a negative note, because I think even with these handicaps, the basic line of this lecture, my point has been that over the past 4,000 years, the ability of humanity to fight our problems, to work miracles, has been extraordinary. That has been made possible when we have worked together, when we have learned from each other. And that is why cities are mankind's greatest invention, because they enable us to become more human by learning from each other, by working collaboratively, and by together creating miracles. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Glaeser. That was a very informative and enjoyable talk. We have some time for questions. Any questions? We have a mic at the back. So
we have the roving mic, and I'm perfectly capable of cold calling on people. It's what I do with my normal thing. So I expect some questions. Otherwise, I'm just going to start picking on you. And the questions will be about foreign policy too. So it's yeah. Yes, sir. Right. So I think there are a couple of things that are critical in terms of thinking about this. I mean, as I alluded to, I am not a friend of home mortgage interest deduction, which I think encourages Americans to buy bigger houses, to build bigger houses. It's highly regressive, right? The average benefit enjoyed by a family earning more than $250,000 is about 10 times larger than the average benefit enjoyed by a family earning between $45,000 and $75,000. From an urban perspective, there's such a strong connection between structure type and ownership type. More than 85% of single-family detached houses are owner-occupied. More than 85% of multifamily dwellings are rented. When we are pushing people towards owning, and look, I'm an owner. There's nothing wrong with owning, but we're basically saying there's one way to live, and that way typically does not involve a rented urban apartment. Now, given the sensitivity of America's housing market, I wouldn't gut the home mortgage interest deduction overnight. I would do a temporary reduction by about $100,000 a year in the upper limit on the home mortgage interest deduction from about $1 million to $300,000 over the next 7 years. This wouldn't be a major jolt to the housing market. It's something that we could reasonably take, and I think it's the first place to start. The other lessons that we have about cities and tax policy is it's very, very hard for local levels of government to engage in anything that is
redistributive, that it even involves paying for their own social safety net. Because if you try and do a social welfare program at the local level, the rich people and businesses just leave. They don't want to pay for it. Which is why we do have to do whatever level of redistribution we think is appropriate for the country, whatever level of social safety net we think needs to be appropriate, can't be done at the local level. It has to be done at higher levels of government. I will say, in terms of local taxes, there's a lot to be said for Henry George. Focusing on property taxes at the local level rather than income taxes makes a lot of sense, because the property taxes are less likely to push rich people out of metropolitan area, out of some areas into others. So I would say that the traditional American reliance on the property tax, if it can be turned into a land tax that doesn't distort the incentive to build up, so much the better. But I think there's a lot to be said for that as well. But thank you for your question. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, I try to make it a practice not to comment on local political issues, at which I am. I will say that there are critical issues in a commuter tax. On one level, it does seem reasonable to expect people to use city services to pay for it, although there is a sense in which commuters are already partially paying for it in the value of the property that they use downtown. On the other hand, a commuter tax can also have a, profound suburbanizing impact on employment, which is something to watch out for in terms of the impact of it. So there is a whole line of research about local revenue hills, which suggests, there's something that was called the Laffer curve that was about sort of an optimal tax rate, and above that you cause tax revenues to increase by pushing up taxes. There's no Laffer curve at the national level, or if there is, we're very far from it, right? I mean, our tax rates are quite low by international standards. It is quite possible, and there are a number of respected economists who have signed off on this, that you get Laffer curves at the local level at very low tax rates, because you start raising taxes and businesses just move out. And I would worry about that in terms of commuter taxes as well. But I want to make it very clear, I do not have a stance on this particular tax issue, nor do I have on any local Scranton related issue, nor do I have a view on the presidential election, and I especially don't have any view on a foreign policy debate that's going on here. The other questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for coming.
How would you suggest the United States goes about bettering the education of our children and college students? Does the government have to get involved? Would you argue that, or would, the Constitution saying that the government doesn't have to get involved, or would you say
for education?
On education, is there some type of desire within the people of Singapore to do better than others that the United States doesn't have, or how do we go about getting that desire, if so?
Look, you can't, Singapore is not, Singapore has certain amounts of, economic freedom in lots of areas. Singapore is not a laissez-faire country, right? It's Lee Kuan Yew's vision of what a country could be. And it just happened that Lee Kuan Yew's vision was very profoundly education-centered. Now, that may be cultural, but any cultural explanation has to then come up with the view that America led the world in education for much of the 20th century. Right? We were pioneers of mass education, and that if you want to explain our success in the middle decades of the 20th century, our early investment in schools had a lot to do with it. And a lot of that came out of the wealth of the farm states. It came out not from the city, in fact. It came out of places like Iowa and Nebraska and so forth. So I don't believe there's anything cultural in America that makes us anti-education, given that we led the world in it for so long, although it is hard to find that necessarily right now. Now, your question about government, we've always had, we continue, education is overwhelmingly a government enterprise. It's primarily been a local government enterprise. I think many people, myself included, are unhappy with the way that too many of our localities have dealt with this. And there are two reasons why, from a sort of economics point of view, you wouldn't necessarily expect localities to manage this problem. One thing is that when we actually talk about equity, redistribution, whatever one you want to call it, education is the best game in town, right? There's relatively little tolerance or eagerness in the U.S. for large-scale adult redistribution of various forms. Just look at the way the president was pilloried for using the word once. And I'm not, part of the beauty of being an economist is that we often say, we can't tell you how much redistribution we think should happen in society. We're just going to try and tell you how to do it efficiently, whatever you want to do it. So I use the word completely without bias one way or the other. I'm taking your preferences for how much equality you want, not trying to impose mine on you. But it's pretty clear that education is the most sustainable gain in town. We can actually support, in bettering poorer children by investing in their education in a way that we couldn't possibly do so with large-scale transfer payments to their adult equivalents. Now, if you think it's about redistribution, then leaving it purely up to the locality doesn't work. You actually have to have investments from all of America, because I have trouble believing that America's children aren't all of our responsibility. that all of us have an obligation to make sure that every child has a brighter future. The second reason is that there are externalities from education, that one person's education benefits us all. You saw that in the cross-city work. That's what those effects of why city education matters so much is so valuable. That's what it means when I say that as the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your wages go up by 8%, holding your skills constant. You gain as we educate other people. That's another reason why the federal government has a potential role in education. It's difficult because it involves the feds not working with the state governments, which is a more natural level, but the feds leaping over the state government to influence localities. Now, that being said, I like both I like Race to the Top a lot. It's my favorite thing during the entire Obama administration. And I'll even say a few kind words for No Child Left Behind. I think actually that also moved in the right direction. So I think actually putting some pressure on localities to measure, to create more accountability. And one of the unforeseen benefits, or perhaps it was foreseen, one of the side benefits of things like Race to the Top is it pushed Massachusetts to raise the cap on the number of charter schools. So I think that's another thing that's really critical, is getting more competition and innovation, particularly in urban areas. If you think about it, if you want to think about sort of public schools in cities, think about what would happen if you took all the restaurants in New York and you said, instead of having all these restaurants, we were going to have a single public canteen that was going to provide everybody's food. We're going to turn off all this competition and innovation. And it sounds bizarre, right? And yet that's exactly what we've done in the school business. Instead of having all this private innovation and competition, all these startups who can do magical new things, we have a large public monopoly. Now, we've been aware of this problem, and Joel Klein is a personal hero of mine. I mean, Joel Klein, who ran the New York City public school system for 8 years and worked incredibly hard. Brilliant guy, very, very passionate, very, very smart about this stuff. But the truth of the matter is he barely moved the needle, and I think it's just a reminder of how challenging these problems are and how every teacher, every leader of a school district deserves our thanks, deserves our gratitude, but this problem is just enormously difficult and one that will face America for years and decades to come. It just is critical that we not get distracted and by other things, and remember that this is really the future of our country. And if you ask yourself about the current, I won't certainly say anything positive or negative about any particular candidate, but I'll say both of them, neither of them have outshined themselves by focusing on education during the presidential during the presidential election. And I think the country actually would be well served by much more focus on human capital. Do I have time for one more question? All right, one more. Yes, sir. If you think about much of travel, so I can remember having, I've had these conversations with many people who have far more power than I do in these areas. I believe America needs to invest in its infrastructure. I absolutely believe that. I just don't see a reason why it needs to be funded by general tax revenues. I think we need to ask ourselves why the infrastructure isn't being invested in, figure out how to do it better. And I don't believe that we need to subsidize people to travel. There are also, if you believe in any of this, global warming stuff, right, bribing people to drive is a really bad idea, right? But let's take a very clear example. Many of you, I imagine, have flown through this airport called John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. It's typically seen as being like a symbol of American infrastructure decline. I agree with that. I think John F. Kennedy Airport should be a heck of a lot nicer than it is. But there's no reason why the good taxpayers of Scranton or Oklahoma City or Dallas should be paying for John F. Kennedy International Airport to become Glaeser, right? There's every reason to expect the quite well-heeled travelers who go through John F. Kennedy International Airport to pay for that. There's no reason to have that infrastructure not paid for with landing fees. The problem is, of course, that JFK is rolled in as part of the Port Authority of New York, which has got a lot on its plate, right? Which doesn't allow it to particularly focus on improving JFK. So the situation languishes, but the answer to that is not some large-scale federal spending on this thing. It's figuring out smarter ways to, through public-private partnerships, things like the Port Authority, to work things better. And I would say the same things. I can remember a conversation with a close friend of mine who is again, qualifies as far more powerful than I'll ever be, who said, look, Ed, I know you've been a critic of this infrastructure spending of this administration, but I just want people to be able to drive through big cities and get trucks to get their business. And I said, absolutely, you're right. But there's no reason why American businesses can't pay for the social costs of those roads. There's no reason why they actually need to be subsidized by American taxpayers to drive longer distances. And I just don't think, this city is well connected. This country is well connected by and large. We made those big investments in the 19th and 20th century. And by all means, we need to maintain those investments. We need to do new innovative things. But that doesn't mean that we need to have general tax revenues pay for it. We need to have nimble means of adjusting to new changing circumstances, and that's really what we need going forward. And I ask you just think about, what do you think is the biggest public transit innovation of the past 15 years, the biggest change? And I submit to you that the reasonable argument is it's the cheap buses plying the Northeast Corridor. It's things like Bolt Bus and Megabus and the Chinese buses. All of that came out of competition and innovation. None of it came from the top down. Would it have happened without the Eisenhower interstate highway system? Of course not. And government plays a role in this, absolutely. But it happened because of nimble startups, not because of some large-scale tax expenditure. And the People Mover monorail, I think, reminds us that this is an area in which it is possible to waste hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars unless you apply cost-benefit analysis really assiduously. And I think that's, I guess, the final message that I want to apply to this. I'm not anti-infrastructure. I mean, in fact, I tried to tell the story about clean water in New York to make the point that actually New York needed to spend vast amounts on the Croton Aqueduct to make the city livable. And the cities of Asia need to spend unbelievable amounts in making themselves livable through massive investments in water and roads and so forth. All of that needs to happen. But it needs to be smart. And it needs to be done not with either blind faith in infrastructure or blind faith that any form of government spending is foolish. Both of these are idiotic paths, right? We need to use our brains, and that means applying cost-benefit analysis, thinking very, very hard through these things. It's not that we shouldn't have some public subsidy of rail, given the downsides of having people drive. Typical estimates are something like 10 cents a mile. But you need to actually calibrate the subsidy to the rail companies to the benefit that people get from driving. You need to be smart about it. And that, I guess, is the final lesson, right? I mean, the most important thing to take away from this in public policy analysis, and to apply this to the election and so forth, is not that, the answer isn't in ideology, although we all know there's something great about freedom and there's something great about caring for the less advantaged. Both of these are great things to have. But the real key is to make sure that we're smart about it, because we're fundamentally going to get the level of government that we deserve. And unless we're smart about our policies, unless we apply rigor and reason and these boring tools like cost-benefit analysis, we're going to keep on making bad mistakes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again for coming. This concludes our Henry George program. We hope to see you again next year. Have a great night.